If you can make me cry with that pathetic little performance, I'll give you not just a loaf of bread, but a whole banquet for both of you," laughed Maestro William Thompson, director of the prestigious Metropolitan Music Academy, while the entire elite present at the gala party burst into cruel laughter. The twins Anna and Grace, only 16 years old, stood motionless in the center of the Golden Hall, their worn clothes contrasting brutally with the designer dresses and tailored suits around them. They had just been dragged into the party by security guards after begging for a piece of bread at the back door. "Look everyone, we have two little street performers wanting to entertain us," scoffed socialite Margaret Hayes, filming everything with her diamond-encrusted cell phone. "This is going to go viral on Instagram." Anna, always the braver of the two, held Grace's trembling hand tightly and stared at those contemptuous faces with a serenity that should have served as a warning. Her eyes revealed something that none of those rich people could interpret, a dangerous calmness of someone who had weathered much worse storms. "Sir, we just need a piece of bread. We haven't eaten in 3 days," Grace whispered, her voice almost inaudible, as she clutched a broken toy violin she had found in the trash to her chest. Maestro Thompson approached with a predatory smile. "Ah, but you've come to the right place. Here we love exotic talents. Let's do this. If you can play something that doesn't put my guests to sleep with boredom, you'll get what you asked for." The crowd settled into their seats as if preparing to watch a circus of horrors. Phones were raised to record the spectacle of humiliation. What none of them noticed was the slight smile that crossed Anna's lips, not one of nervousness, but of someone who was about to rewrite all the rules of this cruel game. Grace positioned the broken violin on her shoulder, her hands finding positions that seemed too natural for someone who had supposedly learned music on the streets. Anna closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, there was something different there, as if a silent force had awakened. What that arrogant elite didn't know was that they were about to witness something that would forever change their privileged lives. Because behind those worn-out clothes and apparent vulnerability lay a secret too powerful to be contained much longer. If this story of prejudice and overcoming adversity has touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple moment of humiliation would turn into the most epic turnaround that the American music elite would never forget. "My God, look at those two. They look like two wet birds," laughed socialite Margaret Hayes, approaching the twins as if observing animals in a zoo. "William, you have to film this for our documentary on urban charity." Maestro Thompson adjusted his tailored tuxedo and walked around the girls like a predator analyzing his prey. "You know what, Margaret? Let's make this more educational. How about we teach these two little artists how the real world of music works?" Anna kept her eyes fixed on the marble floor, but Grace could feel the silent anger radiating from her sister. They had been through this before, the humiliation disguised as an opportunity, the sadistic pleasure of the privileged in playing with the dignity of others. "First, let's evaluate your instruments," Thompson continued, taking the broken violin from Grace's trembling hands. The wood was cracked, the strings rusted, and the bow had a few loose hairs. "My goodness, this must have come from the trash, right?" The crowd burst into laughter as Thompson held up the violin like a trophy. "Folks, just look at the quality. This is what happens when people with no musical education try to play artist." Grace lowered her head, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Anna, however, took an imperceptible step forward, subtly positioning herself between her sister and those cruel stares. Her fingers lightly touched Grace's arm, a gesture that Thompson interpreted as fear, but which was actually a silent code between the two. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," Thompson announced theatrically, "let's give these young ladies a real music lesson. Does anyone here have a smartphone to record? This is going to go viral." Margaret had already positioned her cell phone, broadcasting live to her 2 million followers on Instagram. "Guys, you won't believe what's happening here at the Metropolitan Academy Gala. Two street girls want to teach us classical music." Comments began to appear on the screen. "This is hilarious. Poor things, someone calls social services. How embarrassing." What none of them knew was that years ago, a retired teacher named Miss Dorothy had found the twins sleeping behind a music school destroyed by fire. Instead of calling the authorities, she took them home and for 2 precious years, taught them not only musical technique, but also something much more valuable, that true talent did not need an audience to exist. "Music doesn't live in expensive instruments," Miss Dorothy used to say as Anna and Grace practiced on her out-of-tune piano. "It lives here," she would say, touching the girls' chests. "And when it lives in the right place, any instrument becomes sacred." But Miss Dorothy had died suddenly, and the twins were back on the streets before any adoption process could be completed. What they took with them, however, was something that neither hunger nor cold could steal: years of intensive training and a deep understanding of music that went far beyond sheet music and theory. "Very well, little maestros," Thompson sneered, returning the broken violin to Grace with an exaggeratedly formal gesture. "Show us what you're capable of. But remember, you're playing for people who pay $500 a ticket to hear real artists." Anna lifted her face for the first time since they entered the hall. Her eyes met Thompson's for only a second, but it was enough to send a chill down the conductor's spine. It wasn't submission he saw there, it was the dangerous calm of someone who was calculating their next move. "Grace," Anna whispered, her voice too low for the others to hear, "remember the autumn sonata Miss Dorothy taught us?" Grace nodded almost imperceptibly, her fingers already finding the right positions on the damaged violin. Years of practice on broken instruments had taught the twins something no expensive conservatory could teach: how to extract beauty from the impossible. "Oh, how cute!" Margaret shouted to the camera. "They're whispering strategies. As if two street girls could surprise us." What that arrogant elite was about to discover was that some surprises are too devastating to be predicted. Because every cruel taunt, every gesture of contempt, every moment of humiliation was feeding something inside the twins that was growing like a silent storm, a force that would turn that night of mockery into the most expensive lesson any of those privileged people would ever receive. Each new humiliation only strengthened something inside them that their oppressors couldn't see, a silent force fueled by the very injustice they sought to impose. What those privileged people didn't know was that every act of contempt was writing their own sentence of defeat, and that behind those tears lay the power to forever rewrite the definition of who deserves to be on stage. Grace positioned the broken violin on her shoulder, and for a moment that lasted only a fraction of a second, something extraordinary happened. Her fingers found the strings with a precision that made Thompson frown involuntarily. That posture, that steadiness, it was too technical for a street kid. Wait. Margaret laughed, interrupting before the first note was played. "Did you guys see that? She really thinks she knows how to hold a violin. This is better than any stand-up comedy." The crowd burst into renewed laughter, but Anna remained motionless, watching each face, memorizing each person who was mocking them. Her eyes lingered especially on an elderly man in the corner of the hall, someone who wasn't laughing. Someone who was watching her with a strange expression, almost recognition. "You know what, William?" Margaret said, moving even closer to the camera. "Let's make this more interesting for my followers. How about we offer a real prize? If they manage to play something that isn't a complete disaster, I'll donate $1,000 to charity." The suggestion drew enthusiastic applause from the audience. Thompson smiled mischievously. "Even better, Margaret. If they really impress us, I'll offer a full scholarship to the Metropolitan Academy." The sarcasm was so obvious that even the children in attendance laughed. A scholarship to the Metropolitan Academy? For two street girls? It was like promising the moon. Grace trembled, but Anna put her hand on her sister's shoulder and whispered something only she could hear. "Remember the promise we made to Miss Dorothy on her deathbed?" Miss Dorothy had been more than a teacher to them. For 2 precious years, after finding them sleeping behind the ruins of the burned-down music school, she had become their mother, mentor, and guardian. It wasn't just music lessons she offered, it was unconditional love and a musical education that rivaled the best conservatories in the country. "Music isn't about technical perfection," Miss Dorothy used to say as she watched the girls practice on her out-of-tune piano. "It's about truth. And when you play the truth, even the hardest hearts will open." She had died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving the twins orphaned again before any legal proceedings could secure their custody. But not before making them promise something crucial: one day when the world tries to diminish you, show them what you are truly capable of. Not for revenge, but for all the children like you who need to see that it is possible. "Let's get on with this charade," Thompson shouted, already impatient. "I have more important commitments tonight." Grace took a deep breath and positioned the bow. The first sound that came out of the broken violin made some of the guests laugh before she even finished the first musical phrase. But as the notes continued, something strange began to happen in the hall. The instrument was indeed damaged, the strings out of tune, the wood cracked, but Grace had learned something that no expensive conservatory taught: how to compensate for the instrument's imperfections with pure technique. Each fingering was mathematically calculated to adjust the tuning in real time. It was a level of skill that took decades to master. "Are you hearing that?" whispered one violinist in the orchestra discreetly to her colleague next to her. "She's correcting the pitch as she plays. How on earth does a child learn that?" Anna began to sing, and her voice cut through the air like a velvet blade. It wasn't just a beautiful voice, it was a trained, disciplined voice, with perfect diaphragmatic breathing and vibrato control that demonstrated years of rigorous technical study. The music chosen was not casual. It was an original composition that Miss Dorothy had taught specifically for them, a piece that combined advanced classical technique with devastating emotion. Every note had been studied, every breath planned, every movement calculated for maximum emotional impact. Thompson stopped laughing. His expression changed from mockery to confusion, and then to something close to alarm. This was not street music, it was conservatory-level classical music. The controlled breathing, the perfect diction, the impeccable vocal placement. These were unmistakable signs of extensive formal training. "Margaret," he whispered, trying not to be heard on the live feed. "Turn off that camera. Now." But Margaret was mesmerized by the performance, completely absorbed by the transformation happening before her. The broken violin in Grace's hands sounded like a Stradivarius under the fingers of a master. Anna's voice filled the hall with a purity that made some people involuntarily raise their hands to their chests. The elderly man in the corner of the hall took a step forward, his eyes wide. Professor Emeritus Jonathan Mills, former director of the Metropolitan Academy for 30 years, immediately recognized what he was witnessing. These two girls weren't just talented, they were world-class protégées. "Dorothy," he murmured to himself, the pieces falling into place in his mind. "Dorothy Johnson. She found these girls." Professor Mills had mentored Miss Dorothy during her years as a student at the Academy. He knew she had retired prematurely after a disagreement with the Board of Trustees over social inclusion policies. He also knew she had devoted her later years to teaching underprivileged children in the community. But he never imagined she had found such diamonds in the rough. The music continued, and the atmosphere in the hall changed noticeably with each note. Conversations ceased. Cell phones were put away. Even the waiters stopped serving to listen. The technique was undeniable, but it was the emotion behind the music that truly captured the hearts of those present. Thompson felt sweat form on his forehead. His hands trembled slightly as he realized he had made a terrible mistake. These girls were not imposters trying to embarrass themselves. They were real artists, perhaps even more talented than half of his own students. And he had just publicly humiliated them on a live broadcast. "This is impossible," Margaret muttered, finally lowering the camera. "Where did they learn this? Who taught them?" Anna continued singing, but her eyes met Thompson's for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. In that look, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't just musical talent, it was strategic intelligence. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew how much that performance was embarrassing everyone present. She knew she had turned a moment of humiliation into a devastating display of hypocrisy and prejudice. Professor Mills walked slowly toward the makeshift stage, his presence immediately recognized by the other members of the musical elite in attendance. When people realized that the most respected man in American classical music was moving with purpose and reverence toward those two beggars, the silence became absolute. The music was coming to an end, but the echo of its message reverberated in every corner of the hall. Grace played the final chords with a precision that drew audible gasps from the professional musicians in attendance. Anna held the final note with a breath control that demonstrated not only natural talent but years of discipline and rigorous study. As the last sound faded into the air, the silence that followed was unlike anything that Hall had ever experienced before. It was not the silence of embarrassment or mockery. It was the silence of recognition coupled with deep shame. Thompson looked around, realizing that every person in the hall was looking at him, waiting for his reaction. The live stream was still rolling, with thousands of comments appearing on Margaret's cell phone screen, but now the comments had a completely different tone. "What incredible voices. Who are these girls? Does anyone know where I can hear more of their music?" Under the weight of all those eyes that now carried judgment instead of complicity, Anna and Grace remained standing in the center of the hall. But this time they were not seen as intruders or objects of ridicule. They were recognized for what they truly were: extraordinary artists who had just exposed the hypocrisy and superficial prejudice of an elite who considered themselves cultured and refined, but who had almost missed the opportunity to witness true greatness because of their own prejudices about appearance and social class. The silence that followed was broken by the slow, deliberate sound of a single clap. Professor Mills stepped forward across the hall, applauding with a bow that made everyone present turn in his direction. At 78, he was the most respected man in American classical music, and his presence there carried a weight that no one dared ignore. "Extraordinary," he murmured, still clapping as he walked. "Absolutely extraordinary. In 50 years of my career, I have rarely witnessed technique and emotion in such perfect harmony." Thompson felt the blood freeze in his veins. If Professor Mills was impressed, it meant he had just made a devastating public mistake. Margaret instinctively lowered her cell phone, realizing too late that her live broadcast had captured every moment of the humiliation they had tried to impose on the girls. "Professor Mills," Thompson stammered, trying to regain some control of the situation. It was a demonstration of prejudice disguised as tradition?" Mills cut in coldly, stopping in front of the twins. "Of how an institution that should celebrate talent can become the guardian of mediocrity when it allows social class to determine artistic value." The comments on Margaret's live stream exploded. "This man is a legend. Does anyone know who these girls are? Thompson just got destroyed. I want them to record an album." Anna and Grace remained standing, still processing the dramatic change in the environment. Professor Mills crouched down in front of them, bringing himself to the girls' eye level with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the treatment they had received minutes earlier. "May I ask who taught you?" he said softly. "That breathing technique, that precision in your fingering. You don't learn that on your own." "Miss Dorothy Johnson," Anna replied, her voice still trembling from the emotional intensity of the performance. "She found us sleeping behind the music school that burned down and took us home." Professor Mills' eyes instantly filled with tears. "Dorothy," he murmured, raising his hand to his chest. "My dear Dorothy. She always knew how to recognize diamonds where others saw only stones." The revelation struck the room like lightning. Many of those present knew the legend of Miss Dorothy Johnson, the virtuoso who had abandoned a promising career to teach underprivileged children. What none of them knew was that she had found world-class protégés. "Thompson," Mills said, standing up and staring at the conductor with an authority that made the man instinctively recoil. "You just tried to publicly humiliate the last students of the most talented woman this city has ever produced. And you did it on a live broadcast to thousands of people." Margaret looked at her phone in panic. The view count had jumped to over 50,000 people watching live. Each comment was a growing devastation to her reputation. Disgusting elitism. "These girls are amazing. I'm never setting foot in that academy again." "You don't understand," Thompson tried desperately. "They crashed a private party. They were begging for food. I thought." "You thought poverty and skin color determined musical talent?" Mills interrupted with cutting coldness. "You thought your social position gave you the right to humiliate children for the entertainment of a prejudiced audience?" Grace held Anna's hand tightly, still in shock from the dramatic turn of events. The same elite who had mocked them now murmured among themselves with visible embarrassment. Some were already discreetly walking toward the exit, trying to avoid association with the spectacle of prejudice. Professor Mills walked to the center of the hall, his voice projecting to the entire audience. "For those who don't know me, I am Jonathan Mills, Professor Emeritus at Metropolitan Academy for 30 years and Dorothy Johnson's mentor during her formative years. And what I have just witnessed is the most shameful display of cultural ignorance I have ever seen." Margaret desperately tried to end the broadcast, but her hands were shaking so badly that she only managed to drop her phone. The camera continued to capture audio as it rolled across the floor, amplifying every word of the public demolition that followed. "These young women have demonstrated not only exceptional technique, but a deep musical understanding that rivals graduates of prestigious conservatories," Mills continued. "And you treated them as objects of ridicule simply because their appearance and circumstances did not match your limited expectations." Thompson realized his career was collapsing live on air. Every word Mills spoke was being broadcast to tens of thousands of people, including Academy board members, funders, and influential music critics. His decades-long reputation was being destroyed in real time. "Professor Mills, please," he pleaded. "Can we discuss this privately? There's no need to publicly expose public prejudice." Mills cut him off. "Thompson, you chose to turn discrimination into a spectacle. Now face the consequences of that choice." Anna stepped forward, her voice coming out clear and strong for the first time since they had entered the hall. "Professor Mills, we didn't come here to cause trouble. We just wanted an opportunity to show that music has no color or social class." The simple but profound words echoed through the hall with an impact that transcended any vocal technique. It was pure dignity being exercised by someone who had every right to feel anger but chose to demonstrate class. Mills smiled for the first time that evening, recognizing in the twins' demeanor the same nobility of character he had admired in Miss Dorothy. "And you have achieved that magnificently, my dears. You showed something this audience needed to see, that true talent knows no artificial barriers imposed by prejudice." The live broadcast had gone viral. Hashtags such as #Justice for the Twins and #TrueTalent began to appear on social media. The Metropolitan Academy was being bombarded with calls from journalists, and Thompson's reputation was plummeting in real time. Margaret finally managed to pick up her phone, but when she looked at the comments, she realized the damage was irreversible. Her fan base was crumbling as people canceled their subscriptions en masse. Companies that sponsored her were already sending messages cutting contracts. "This is the end," she whispered to herself, watching years of image building disintegrate in a single night. All for turning cruelty into social media content. While Thompson and Margaret faced the public destruction of their reputations, Anna and Grace remained at the center of the hall, not as humiliated victims, but as artists who had unquestionably proven their worth. The contrast was devastating: triumphant dignity versus defeated prejudice. Professor Mills extended his arms to the twins. "Ladies, I would very much like to talk about your future in music. I have some contacts who would love to meet you." But before any plans could be made, before the night was completely over, there was still one final revelation waiting to be discovered. Because what no one in that hall knew was that the twins' story was just beginning, and that the injustice they had suffered that night would become the catalyst for something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. 3 months later, Thompson found himself sitting in a modest apartment in the suburbs, scrolling through job offers that systematically rejected his application. The Metropolitan Academy had terminated his contract the day after the viral broadcast, which racked up over 5 million views in 48 hours. Margaret had lost all her advertising contracts and shut down her social media accounts after being banned from major platforms. Her digital empire of influence completely collapsed as brands rushed to disassociate themselves from the prejudiced socialite who humiliated talented children live on air. The Dorothy twins, as they became known on social media, signed a contract with an independent record label specializing in contemporary classical music. Professor Mills became their official mentor, ensuring a complete musical education and decent housing through a full scholarship that he himself financed. Anna and Grace performed at Carnegie Hall 6 months later in a benefit concert that raised funds for socially vulnerable children. The audience included renowned music critics, all unanimous in recognizing the young girl's exceptional talent. "You turned our pain into purpose," Anna said during an interview, holding Grace's hand. "Miss Dorothy always taught us that true music comes from the heart, not the cradle." Thompson watched the performance on television, realizing too late that he had wasted the opportunity to discover 2 of the most promising musicians of their generation out of pure prejudice. The twins' story became an award-winning documentary, inspiring inclusion policies at conservatories across the country. They proved that genuine talent transcends social barriers when it encounters real opportunity. Professor Mills, now 79, summed it up perfectly: "The greatest tragedy is not being born without privilege, but allowing privilege to blind us to the greatness of others." The Metropolitan Academy created the Dorothy Johnson Program, offering full scholarships to talented young people from disadvantaged communities, ensuring that stories like the twins would be repeated with happy endings from the start. Anna and Grace now divide their time between international performances and free classes in public schools, perpetuating Miss Dorothy's legacy and proving that the best revenge against prejudice is success that transforms lives. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel for more narratives about how true greatness always finds its way, regardless of the obstacles imposed by small minds and closed hearts.